This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Death toll rises to 4. Over 100 still missing in America's Florida building collapse. The UN says the northeast Nigerian insurgency has killed almost 350,000 people. And more than 20 African countries are affected by the third wave of COVID-19. Welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. We'll bring you the details on those stories in just a moment, but first, here's Ramanyang with the day's business headlines. Rama.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Here's what's coming up in the course of the hour. Egypt is set to receive the final tranche of its $5.4 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. And Ghana is headed for the biggest cocoa harvest it's had in at least a decade. We'll have the data and the details on those stories and plenty more coming your way in the next 30 minutes. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Beatrice.
Rama, thank you. And let's start with the devastating collapse of a residential building in the southeast of the United States. At least 4 people have died and more than 100 are still missing. Our correspondent Nitza Soledad Perez reports from Florida. We'd like to warn our viewers the images may contain disturbing content.
Well, hope is fading in Miami. 159 people are unaccounted for. That number has risen overnight from 99. Authorities confirmed that also 4 people are dead. Now, the search and rescue teams worked overnight. Heavy machinery was brought in to help remove the big pieces of concrete. They're also using sonar equipment to detect any sound that's coming from the rubble. At this point, there are 130 firefighters on site. As I was saying, they worked overnight. They managed to recover 3 bodies from the scene. Now, these teams are working in 15-minute shifts, and that's because the equipment they're carrying around is extremely heavy. The situation, it's complicated. The weather is definitely not helping, but they are not giving up. I have to say that the rescue teams, they're showing optimism. But as you can probably see in this live shot, the weather, it's not cooperating. It's been raining this morning. It rained overnight. And as one official said yesterday, contradicting the governor of Florida, that they do not believe they will find people alive.
A latest report by the United Nations Development Programme reveals that the more than 10 years of battling insurgency in northeastern Nigeria have claimed nearly 350,000 lives. Termed one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, more than 9 out of 10 of those killed are children younger than 5. The armed group Boko Haram launched an uprising in 2009, displacing more than 2 million from their homes. Insecurity has led to declines in agricultural production and trade, reducing access to food, health facilities, shelter, and clean water.
The UN agency says the toll is 10 times higher than previous estimates since the conflict started in 2009 by sects called Boko Haram, who now have a rival group, Islamic State of West Africa Province, ISWAP. Of the 350,000 people reportedly killed, the agency says children younger than 5 account for more than 9 out of 10 of those killed, with 170 dying daily. It also cites heavy damage to agriculture, water, trade, food, and health care. Despite government efforts, the conflict has gone on unabated and spread to neighboring countries, a battle experts describe as unconventional.
You have an insurgency that is primarily caused by religious extremism and has festered around countries with poor state control. You have weak governance structure, such that you have large swaths of land across this region that are ungoverned.
The global body brings the number of people needing immediate assistance in the northeastern region alone to 8.7 million. Majority of them depend on aid like food, shelter, and other relief items. According to the UN, the humanitarian needs may worsen and more than 1.1 million people may die if the conflict continues till 2030. However, President Muhammadu Buhari visited the Northeast last week to commission various humanitarian projects like a 10,000 housing unit, power plants, and colleges with the aim to alleviate the sufferings of the victims there. But experts say there should be a lasting solution to end the war.
There should be a collaboration between the government and the Muslim community around the Sahel to roll back some of these extremist doctrines that are only found in mainstream Muslim theology. And until there's a rollback, what you find is that for every insurgent that is mowed down on the battlefield, there are tens, if not hundreds, of replacements willingly.
President Buhari has approved around $33 million for a community policing scheme across the country, including the troubled Northeast. He has also urged residents to furnish the security operatives with any necessary information that could help to fish out the terrorists from their dens. Tessim Akendi, CGTN Jos, Nigeria.
And still in Nigeria, despite several claims by the Nigerian government that it has defeated the insurgents, Boko Haram and its splinter group, the Islamic State of West African Province, are still active and carrying out deadly attacks. In this next report, CGTN's Deji Badmus highlights some of the key timelines in the insurgency so far.
It all began as a low-scale insurgency in Maiduguri, the capital city of the Northeast Borno State, back in 2009. The founder of Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf, and some of his members had been extrajudicially killed by the police. By July the following year, this man, Abubakar Shekau, declared himself the new leader of the group, vowing to avenge the death of Yusuf and other members of the sect who were killed by security forces. Following from that, the group began carrying out attacks on hard targets, killing policemen and attacking security facilities.
Looking at the pedigree and the capability of the Nigerian military, one had expected that, they would just, within a twinkle of an eye, they would have gotten over this insurgency. But here we are, since 2009 to 2021, we're still battling with insurgency, and only God knows when we're ever going to, get over it.
By September of 2010, Boko Haram carried out an audacious attack on the main prison in the city of Bauchi, in Bauchi State, freeing about 700 inmates, including 100 Boko Haram members. Series of attacks on security formations, churches, schools, and even mosques would later follow. On August 26, 2011, the group struck its first high-profile international target within Nigeria, when a suicide bomber crashed a car into the United Nations building in the country's capital, Abuja, and detonated an explosive, killing at least 23 people and leaving more than 100 others injured. Less than 2 months before then, the group's suicide bomber had targeted the Nigerian police headquarters. The group also carried out several other bombings, including one that targeted a Catholic church in a community known as Madala in the suburb of Abuja, killing at least 25 persons. 7 months later, on January 20, 2012 to be precise, Boko Haram carried out what was its deadliest attack at the time in the northwest Kano state. More than 200 people were killed after the group launched coordinated attacks in the city of Kano, targeting police stations and government facilities. The horrific attacks continued all through 2013. Schools, government buildings, security formations, places of worship were all targeted. By the end of that year, the group had killed over 1,200 in its various attacks. And this was despite the government launching a massive military operation against it. More attacks and killings followed in 2014. But on April 14th of that year, the group carried out an attack that would attract global attention. They stormed the girls' secondary school in a remote community known as Chibok in the northeast Borno state and abducted 276 schoolgirls, prompting the global Bring Back Our Girls campaign to release or rescue the girls. 7 years on, while some have since been freed, over 100 of the schoolgirls are still missing.
Because of that abduction, they still remain relevant in the global atmosphere that every part of the world is concerned about the atrocities that they are perpetrating not only in Nigeria, but also in Nigeria's neighboring countries like Cameroon, Chad and Niger.
The military has succeeded in beating back Boko Haram and its splinter group Islamic State West African Province. But the terrorist groups are far from defeated and continue to carry out attacks after attacks, even in Cameroon, Chad and Niger. Millions of people have been displaced and now live in camps. A few weeks ago, both ISWAP and Boko Haram confirmed the death of Abubakar Shekau after he reportedly blew himself up following clashes between his group and ISWAP. Despite his death, the insurgency is still far from over. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
U.S. President Joe Biden will have his first face-to-face meeting with his Afghan counterpart, Ashraf Ghani, at the White House later today. They're expected to discuss Washington's support for Afghanistan's government as American troops pull out. Afghan forces have been struggling to repel Taliban advances. President Biden announced on Thursday that 9,000 Afghan interpreters who work with the U.S. will be evacuated along with their families before the September withdrawal date. But officials say there is not time to process special visas and most may have to go to other countries first. Sultan Faizi has more.
Afghanistan is in fire. Afghan leaders have left for U.S. Intensified gun battles are underway in more than 20 provinces of Afghanistan. The peace process is kind of halted. We haven't heard anything from Doha yet. And the country is going through an ambiguity, which is a crossroad. Afghanistan has now two options: either go with a civil war or to go with a political settlement. So Afghanistan's people have left in between these two significant options that now the country has been facing. So all these factors have not affected the pullout the process or the process of withdrawal. Since we haven't heard from the US or the international troops after they announced more than 50% of the troops have withdrawn from the country, but then we haven't heard anything. Today we heard some voices from US that some senators have been raising their voices asking to halt the withdrawal process.
A monitoring deal between Iran and the United Nations nuclear watchdog has expired, and the U.S. Secretary of State is warning that Washington could eventually give up on rejoining the 2015 nuclear deal if talks continue to drag on.
We still have serious differences with Iran with regard to returning to mutual compliance with the JCPOA. Our teams are going back for a seventh round of indirect negotiations in the coming days. We'll see if we can bridge the differences, but they're real, and we have to be able to bridge them. I would tell you that with regard to the IAEA, this remains a serious concern, a concern that we've communicated to Iran, and it needs to be resolved.
The International Atomic Energy Agency struck a 3-month monitoring deal with Iran in February. It was extended by a month in May, but expired on Thursday. Officials say they're trying to negotiate another extension. Meanwhile, after 6 weeks of talks in Vienna, key issues on bringing the United States and Iran back into compliance are still unresolved. More graves have been found in Canada linked to Catholic residential schools, just weeks after a similar discovery. Indigenous children were forced to attend these boarding schools from the late 1800s until the 1990s. CGTN's Jim Spellman reports.
In a Zoom call with reporters, tribal elders from the Cowessess First Nation in Canada's Saskatchewan province showed this drone footage of a gravesite. They say ground-penetrating radar has found evidence of 751 potential graves. The elders say the headstones were removed around 1960. Most of the sites are about 1 meter by 1 meter, believed to be the graves of children.
The Catholic Church representatives removed these headstones, and today they are unmarked graves.
This follows the discovery of 215 bodies in a mass grave last month at the Kamloops Catholic Residential School in British Columbia.
These little ones, these precious little ones who were buried unceremoniously with disrespect and disregard are giving us a real opportunity to reflect again on who we are as Canadians, Indigenous people and others.
Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent to these residential schools, where they were taught to ignore their tribal heritage, learn English, and adopt Catholicism. They were the sites of widespread physical and mental abuse. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has apologized for the abuse at the Catholic schools, but the Pope has so far not apologized. At the UN, China has called the abuse of Indigenous children in Canada a, quote, serious human rights violation.
We call for a thorough and impartial investigation into all cases where crimes were committed against the Indigenous people, especially the children.
The Cowessess First Nation will continue its search and expects to find more burial sites. It is now trying to identify those buried in the unmarked graves.
We all must put down our ignorance and accidental racism of not addressing the truth that this country has with Indigenous people. We are not asking for pity, but we are asking for understanding. We need time to heal, and this country must stand by us.
But before the healing can begin, the chief says the truth must be told. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Bethesda, Maryland.
You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead on the program. More than 20 African countries affected by a third wave of COVID-19. And Uganda's president calls for national prayers as the country battles a second wave.
"100 years of trailblazing, 100 years of striving. From extreme poverty to a well-off society. From a sleeping giant to a responsible global power. Mission and vision. From the past and into the future. Decoding the Communist Party of China. 100 years and counting. Only on CGTN.
The African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention warned that the third wave, which is now affecting more than 20 nations in Africa, could have a much more devastating impact than ever seen before since the beginning of the pandemic in the continent. The Africa CDC Director John Ngengasong emphasized that the third COVID-19 variant is much more aggressive and is rapidly spreading across the continent. Here is CGTN's Girum Chala with more.
The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is worried. It says it has reasons to believe that the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic is seriously affecting more than 20 member states.
We are in the middle of a third wave. At least 20 countries are now fully in the middle of their third wave across the continent, and it is a very devastating. One thing we see is that the peak of the third wave is remarkably higher than the peak of when we had the second wave.
What is known as the third wave has shockingly stretched the health infrastructures of African states, with huge hospital bed shortages being reported. John Ngengasong says the third wave is also worsening due to the Delta variant.
Within 6 weeks, that variant in DRC became a very, very predominant variant. And with that analysis is going on across several member states to understand what the situation is. And maybe, and just maybe, the variant in question is the Delta variant is perhaps playing a very significant role.
Africa still is banking on the prospects of vaccinating its citizens to permanently defeat the COVID-19 pandemic. But that plan is in jeopardy as the continent only vaccinated 1.1% of its population so far. The good news is Africa CDC is expecting hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines and has finished preparations to produce jobs within the continent. Group Dala CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Meanwhile, South Africa is racing to vaccinate its population as it battles a vicious third wave. New infections are now around 17,000 a day, surpassing the previous 2 waves. A substantial consignment of vaccines is expected in the next few weeks, but there is also a call for other vaccines such as China's Sinovac and Russia's Sputnik to be approved. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
South Africa is facing a grave situation as COVID-19 infections soar and many are still dying.
We know that the current wave is largely driven by the surge in Gauteng. The 7-day moving average graph now clearly shows that in Gauteng this wave has passed the first 2 waves, and it is inevitable that the wave in Gauteng will spill over into the rest of the country.
The population remains vulnerable, with just 3% vaccinated so far following hiccups, including the destruction of 2 million doses of contaminated Johnson & Johnson's vaccines. Pfizer has to date delivered 4.5 million doses, with more on the way.
They have also committed just over 15.5 million doses in Q3, of which we are expecting nearly 2.1 million doses in July. Johnson & Johnson have so far delivered 500,000 and 1.2 million doses landed last night. We are awaiting confirmation for delivery of 500 doses, and this then will make up 2 million to replace those that were affected in terms of the continuation.
Opposition party Economic Freedom Fighters meanwhile flouted lockdown laws and brought the capital Pretoria to a halt. It's demanding China's Sinovac and Russia's Sputnik V be approved for use in 7 days.
We are here for a simple thing: approve other vaccines so that they are available to all South Africans. We want them to answer one question: what is it that is extremely wrong with Sputnik and Sinovac, which is not found in J&J? Because J&J has been having problems one after another.
Strict protocols govern vaccine approval to protect the population.
We will go with vaccines that work locally. It's not going to be enough for companies to submit applications to SAPRA, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, without demonstration of efficacy or effectiveness against the variant that is dominant in South Africa.
South Africa will have to work fast on boosting vaccinations as the third wave spreads. 100,000 people are being inoculated a day. This is expected to increase to threefold as more vaccines arrive, which will hopefully slow the spread of the virus. Chilishara, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
And Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni has called for national prayers as the country battles a more aggressive second wave of COVID-19. The country has been registering more than 1,000 cases daily since the beginning of June. Isabel Nakiria reports.
The Ugandan leader Yoweri Museveni says he heeded a call from religious leaders to dedicate Friday the 25th to pray for the families and health workers affected by COVID-19. The day has also been declared a public holiday as Uganda continues to witness a surge in cases. Prayers are being held virtually throughout the country.
A day of national prayer, I think, is an acknowledgement that with all the efforts that have gone into the process to try to deal with this particular pandemic, you need an outside intervention, and God's presence is there. We would not be the first people to do that. It has happened over generations past.
We are at a point where we are saying that our trust and our confidence in man is very, very limited and even devastating. But we are putting our faith in God. We are saying, oh, God, save us. We are saying, God, help us.
The country's health facilities are overwhelmed with beds and oxygen running out. The Ministry of Health says it's installing additional plants to supplement the current oxygen capacity. The Ugandan Army and private organizations are supplying oxygen to the public hospitals. In the past 2 weeks, around 30 deaths have been registered every day. The government has imposed stricter restrictions to try and stop the rise in cases. No public and private transport is allowed on the road, and businesses have been ordered to close. Night curfew has also been brought forward to 7 p.m. local time from 9 p.m. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
In Tunis, the national COVID-19 vaccination drive will be stepped up in coming days. Dozens of new vaccination centers Here's Adnan Chauchi with the details.
Tunisian authorities say more Chinese vaccines will be delivered this summer. The Sinovac vaccine will be administered at public vaccination centers. It will later be made available at private pharmacies across Tunisia.
We ordered a total of 12 million doses through different sources, like direct purchase, the COVAX facility, the African procurement system, and donations. We have only received about 2.3 million doses, including about 500,000 doses of Sinovac, which we purchased and were delivered on time to help the vaccination rollout.
The Director General of Tunisian Military Health explained that the Sinovac COVID-19 vaccine has proven its efficiency and safety. In fact, China will reach a staggering 1 billion doses in its COVID-19 vaccination drive. The scale and speed is unrivaled by any other country in the world.
We cannot get rid of this infectious disease without vaccinating the whole population. The vaccine is efficient. There is no risk at all. China's first target was to vaccinate 8 million people per day, but more than 10 million doses are administered per day. China's 1.4 billion people will all get vaccinated. This is a good example. We are just 10 million Tunisians. Together, we can make a vaccination campaign successful, win the COVID-19 war, and revive our economy.
After months of self-isolation, many Tunisians have resumed normal life after receiving their second jab of the COVID-19 vaccine.
I am very confident after getting the vaccine. I've been waiting for months for this special day. Now I can resume a normal life, visit my relatives and friends. My sister got the same vaccine without any side effects. Together we'll go to the park and the market because we feel safe.
The Ministry of Health announced that the list of COVID-19 vaccine priority groups will be expanded to include people with cancer diseases in phase of chemotherapy treatment and candidates for organ transplantation, as well as patients on dialysis. In addition, pregnant women and people with cardiovascular diseases will also be given priority.
Experts assert that China's vaccination campaign is the most successful in the world. Tunisia plans to boost its COVID-19 vaccination rate after the delivery of the Chinese Sinovac vaccines and millions of doses from other countries. Adnan Chauchi, CGTN, Tunis.
On to the fruitful ties now between China and Africa. Zhang Yichun, the Minister Chancellor of the Chinese Embassy here in Kenya, has visited the Sino-Africa Joint Research Center. The Talent Cultivation and Scientific Research Institute, based on the outskirts of the capital Nairobi, is aided by the Chinese government. Since its establishment in 2013, the Sino-Africa Joint Research Center has put forward 50 joint research programs. Let's take a look.
The Sino-Africa Joint Research Center has focused its academic research on topics which include biodiversity, pathogens, and microorganism detection. The center has so far supported the publication of 6 academic specialization and 424 peer-reviewed papers. Professor Robert Gituru, the founding director of the center, says the achievements were made possible by the cooperation of both Chinese and Kenyan scientists.
When we conduct field studies, it is always joint field studies. So most of those field expeditions that have led to the discovery of those plants were not just made up of our own African teams, they were combined teams.
Professor Gituru was inspired by the perseverance shown by Chinese researchers. He recalls one of their expeditions to Mount Kenya, which led to the discovery of a new plant.
They told us, yes, I know you are tired, I know you are cold, but this is science and we just can't give up. It's too early to give up. We are just about to see something. And true to his words, that evening at around 4:30, we see a small patch of plants. We all agreed together that this looks like a new species.
The Sino-Africa Joint Research Center is a hub to cultivate young African researchers. So far, it has provided scholarships to 222 students from Africa to pursue both master's and PhD degrees.
From my experience, for my 3 years stay in China, I had a good experience with Chinese people. They are so nice, they were so welcoming. They used to assist us, especially when you're working in the lab. The manuals, they are written in Chinese, you don't know how to interpret. So they used to come, we go and ask them, how do you do this? Then they were so good to us. They used to assist us during our stay in China. They were so good to us.
The first of its kind in Africa, the Sino-Africa Joint Research Center is proactively responding to the Belt and Road Initiative, serving as a platform of scientific cooperation between Chinese and African scientists. Mahemutwa, CGTN.
Well, let's now go to Rama Nyang for a look at the day's business news. Rama.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Here's what's coming up in business. Egypt is set to receive the final tranche of a $5.4 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. And Ghana is headed for the biggest cocoa harvest it has had in a decade. The data coming up next.
Taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Over the last 14 hours of rain.
Welcome back. The Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund has completed the second and final review of Egypt's economic reform program. Now, the review's completion effectively paves the way for the North African state to get the third tranche of a $5.4 billion loan. This particular tranche is worth $1.7 billion. The IMF's Executive Board approved Egypt's request to obtain the loan last June in order to support the country's second wave of its economic reform program during the COVID-19 crisis. Egypt's economic growth is expected to get to just under 3% in the 2020-2021 fiscal year, before then rising to 5.2% in the fiscal year that follows. However, the outlook is still clouded by a fair bit of uncertainty, as Egypt does remain vulnerable to a whole range of shocks due to its high public debt and its large financing needs. In Ghana, the world's second largest cocoa producer, the country is headed for its biggest harvest in at least a decade. This comes after a combination of good weather and government intervention helped to boost output. Total cocoa bean output stood at 965,000 tons by the 3rd of June, when the main crop harvest ended. That's already the highest in 5 years, before accounting for some main crop deliveries that were still underway and a 12-week mid-crop season that ends in September. Now, earlier on, projections had estimated that the smaller harvest would produce some 50,000 tons of cocoa beans. The Ghana Cocoa Board now expects that the annual harvest will exceed the 1 million mark for the first time since the 2010-2011 season. South Africa's state-owned power supplier, Eskom, says it will implement a 1.5% increase in basic wages from the 1st of July. And he says it will be funding this through savings realised from reviewing employee benefits. Eskom's latest offer is dependent on savings from benefits including overtime and travel, where the state-owned utility says it has found excesses. Unions, however, are rejecting this offer. They're accusing the loss-making utility of disregarding the rules around wage negotiations by implementing its final offer to workers. Wage talks between unions and Eskom ended earlier this month without a firm agreement. For years now, the utility has been struggling to provide consistent, affordable electricity to Africa's most industrialized nation. Its debt load of over $28 billion has been repeatedly flagged as a risk to South Africa's public finances. Well, still in South Africa, headline inflation jumped to a 30-month high in the month of May. According to Statistics South Africa, inflation stood at 5.2% year-on-year in May compared to 4.4% in April. That was the highest inflation reading since November 2018, and it was driven up by higher prices in the food, transport and non-alcoholic beverages categories. From Johannesburg, here's Sumitra Naidu.
It's the highest reading since November 2018.
but it didn't come as a complete surprise. Some economists say the annual inflation rate came in line with expectations. That's because it's coming off a low base. Oil prices crashed this time last year as governments around the world imposed lockdowns, forcing businesses to close and restricting the movement of people. Everything measured in the basket of goods rose in May. Food and transport costs were the main drivers.
Food, we've had a couple of outliers as well, the tomato shortages and some of the fruit and veggie shortages and all the rain and everything else. I think one more thing that we just have to take into consideration is that the very low base from which we are coming.
While South Africans struggle to get back into work mode as the economy reopens, they also have to deal with the rising cost of living. Transport was the biggest driver in these latest inflation figures, and that's because petrol prices have gone up almost 42% since last year.
Food and non-alcoholic beverages came in 6.7% higher, while the cost of transport rose 15.3% year-on-year in May. Fuel costs went up 37% from 21% in April. Even the price of cooking oil rose significantly, up 8.5% since April, but 30% up since last year.
Everything is up, even like the taxes now. It's difficult to get to work or to wherever you're going because the transport has gone up, the petrol has gone up, so it's difficult to make the ends meet.
Pretty much everything has gone up these days, transport-wise, food cost and everything.
These days you can't do groceries with less than 2,000 rands, for an example, and you still have to pay other bills like rent. Electricity is expensive. It doesn't last long like in the olden days.
It's unlikely to get any easier as this number could push the Reserve Bank to hike rates. At 5.2%, the inflation rate has now gone beyond the midpoint of the bank's target band of 3 to 6%.
Need higher interest rates in South Africa to attract scarce capital, not just in the short term to support the currency, but also in the longer term to support the economic growth. I'm just hoping they might give us 2 or 3 more months of breathing room, especially for the consumer that we know is still under a lot of pressure.
The Reserve Bank cut rates by 300 basis points last year and said it would keep the rate low as long as inflation remained at a moderate level. With consumer inflation now over 5%, it's unlikely that the bank can delay a rate hike any longer. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to the opposite end of the continent, Tunisia's government has set a target to generate 30% of its electricity needs from renewable sources by 2030. Right now, 97% of the electricity consumed in Tunisia comes from fossil fuels. A big chunk of that comes from natural gas plants. As Adnan Chouachi now reports, authorities in the North African state want to increase public and private sector investments, especially in solar and wind.
Tunisia has a current power production capacity of 1.175 megawatts installed in 25 power plants, but majority of it is from non-renewable sources. The country's Industry, Energy and Mines Minister Mohamed Boussaid said that the state will invest around $3.6 billion to achieve its objective of having 30% of its renewable energy by 2030. It hopes to achieve this target in partnership with the private sector.
This is the future, the transition from traditional electricity production from natural gas to renewable sources of energy. The national target is 3,800 megawatts. It will involve many partners, including the National Electricity and Gas Company, that will produce 300 megawatts in the first transitional phase.
Only 3% of Tunisia's electricity is generated from renewables, including hydroelectric, solar and wind energy. The Director General of Electricity and Energy Transition explained that opting for renewables is a strategic choice for the North African state.
The energy situation in Tunisia is characterized by a growing deficit in primary energy sources. It reached more than 57% in 2019 and 2020. Since 2013, Tunisia has put in place a strategy for developing renewable energy. The whole new energy strategy is based on renewables.
The 2015 project is based on 3 regimes. The first one is the auto production regime, which allows industrialists and consumers to produce their own electricity and control the cost of energy consumption. The second regime targets small and medium-sized projects. It aims to develop partnerships between foreign investors and locals. 44 project agreements that will produce 400 megawatts of electricity were signed under this project.
The last regime was the concession regime. It was the pillar of energy substitution because it was for big projects which are developed by mega companies. Therefore, in 2018, we launched the implementation of the photovoltaic cells, which calls for tenders under concessions to produce 500 megawatts. This project is awaiting Parliament's approval.
The installation of 500 megawatts of solar photovoltaic energy is scheduled on 5 different sites in the governorates of Sidi Bouzid, Qarouan, Gafsa, Tozeur and Tataouine.
According to the Minister of Industry, Energy and Mines, Tunisia is determined to accelerate its energy transition with a view to achieve energy security through a diversified energy mix and to improve the country's economic competitiveness. Adnan Shawashi, CGTN, Tunis.
Still on the business of energy, Egyptian authorities say that since mid-2018, the country has connected over 3.5 million housing units to piped natural gas supplies, and the North African state plans to spend over $700 million on a range of climate adaptation policies. Those include supplying more homes with natural gas and converting vehicles to be running on LPG, which Egypt has an abundance of, instead of diesel and gasoline. Here's Yasser Hakim with this report from Cairo.
Egypt's government has been working hard to replace butane gas cylinders with natural gas around the country. The North African state's latest gas discoveries in the Red Sea and East Mediterranean have allowed it to be self-sufficient, making natural gas a better option than fuel or butane.
The more we put natural gas in houses, the more we save in petroleum products and butane imports. This reduces state expenditure, reduces subsidies on energy, improves the state budget and cuts deficit. For citizens, using natural gas is cheaper than butane gas cylinders and cheaper than electricity. And finally, you are cutting on pollution because natural gas is cleaner than fuel, butane and oil.
According to Egypt's petroleum minister, 3.5 million units have benefited from the service since 2018, making a total of 11.5 million units operating on natural gas. To encourage Egyptians to transfer to natural gas, the government has subsidized the cost of setting up the gas pipelines at home, and payments are allowed for over 6 years. It's also offering discounts on monthly bills for commercial and industrial units.
The government is targeting to speed up the process and introduce natural gas to 1.2 million units per year so that most houses would have natural gas in about 3 years' time.
But there are logistical challenges, including reaching out to ill-equipped cities. The government has introduced mobile natural gas trucks that pump gas not just for cars, but for houses and factories in remote areas. The project is part of the government's drive for renewable energy.
Field EU leaders rejected a proposal to resume formal talks with Russia during the second day of the EU Leaders Summit. France and Germany wanted to cooperate with Moscow on climate change and also to find ways of stabilizing relations. But Poland and Baltic countries said it would send the entirely wrong message as East-West ties are deteriorating. Italy is a big exporter to Russia with investments in Russian energy. It also backed a summit with Moscow. The EU already has sanctions in place on the Russian energy, financial and arms sectors, as well as personal sanctions on Russians accused of human rights abuses or of using banned chemical weapons. Back into the business of aviation in Africa. After 44 years in manned aviation, Kenya Airways is now keen on growing its recent UAV subsidiary into a business that it thinks can bring in around $200 million in annual revenues. The airline will also be working with the Brazilian aerospace firm Embraer to test electric urban aerial mobility solutions. Now, the airline has set up a subsidiary, it's called Fahari Aviation, to provide UAV pilot training as well as commercial surveillance and inspection operations. KQ anticipates that the tests of electric urban mobility with Embraer's eVTOL aircraft, which you're seeing on your screens now, should start sometime next year. After years of losses, KQ is pursuing new revenue lines and new markets as part of a turnaround plan. Passenger traffic fell by nearly 66% last year to just 1.8 million passengers. Losses widened to over $335 million.
We think that in the next 5 years, we'll be growing, we'll be doubling growth every single year for the next 5 years. very excited about this, and you know, I don't think we are necessarily aggressive in our projections. This is new technology, efficient technology. There is a wide range of applications out there. You mentioned logistics. That's just one. I mean, I think, in fact, at least in this region, I think the need is more on surveillance, inspections. That's actually where the need is. Logistics is important, but you know, there's restriction on payload, so those ones will be limited. On top of that, you actually mentioned, now you mentioned logistics, you mentioned cargo, but in the next 5 years, you know, who knows, you know, you could have actually passenger, you know, doing urban mobility. And already we've signed a contract with, you know, one of the providers, one of the OEMs. We want to be the pilot for Africa for urban mobility.
And you'll be hearing a little bit more from Alan Kilavuka in the next hour. But ahead in global business, we'll be focusing on Tanzania and its economic reforms. This weekend, President Samia Suluhu Hassan marks 100 days in office following the sudden death of a predecessor, John Pombe Magufuli, in March. The East African nation has seen investments surge, and it's registered 92 investment projects worth some $3.5 billion just in Q2. But what lies ahead for that East African economy? We'll have some analysis for you live from Dar es Salaam at the top of the hour. See you then. For now, back to Beatrice.
Rama, thank you. And here's what's coming up on the program. Thierry Neuville storms to a Safari rally lead as rival drivers struggle.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find